The year was 2347, and humanity had spread across a dozen star systems, building colonies on distant worlds and forging a modest but resilient interstellar civilization that stretched far beyond the blue planet where they had first learned to walk upright and dream of the stars above them. Commander Daniel Harris stood on the bridge of the starship Valor's Edge, watching the endless darkness of space through the main viewport as his crew went about their duties with practiced efficiency. He had commanded this vessel for 7 years now, and he knew every sound she made, every vibration in her hull, every whisper of her engines as they pushed through the void between worlds. The distress signal had come 3 hours ago from the mining colony on Kepler 442b, a harsh but resource-rich world where 3,000 humans had built their lives among the red rocks and copper-colored skies. The message had been garbled and desperate, filled with screams and the sound of weapons fire, before cutting off into silence that felt heavier than any words could have been. "How long until we arrive?" Daniel asked, his voice steady, despite the cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. Lieutenant Laura Vance looked up from her console, her dark eyes reflecting the blue glow of her screens as she calculated their trajectory. She was the ship's intelligence officer, brilliant and observant, with a mind that could piece together puzzles that left others completely baffled. 17 minutes, Commander," she replied, her fingers dancing across the controls as she pulled up every scrap of data they had received from the colony. When the Valor's Edge dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Kepler 442b, the bridge fell silent in a way that made Daniel's skin crawl. Below them, where lights should have been glowing from the domed habitats and mining facilities, there was only darkness, and the faint orange glow of fires still burning among the ruins. "Take us down," Daniel ordered, his jaw tight as he stared at the devastation below. The landing team found nothing but death and destruction. Buildings had been torn apart by weapons that left scorch marks, unlike anything in human databases, and bodies lay scattered in the streets, frozen in their final moments of terror and desperate flight. The colonists had tried to fight back. Daniel could see that much from the makeshift barricades and the weapons still clutched in cold hands. But they had been overwhelmed by something far more powerful than anything they could have imagined. Laura knelt beside a damaged security terminal, working quickly to extract whatever footage might have survived the attack. When the screen flickered to life, Daniel felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. The attackers were not human. They were tall and insectoid, with gleaming black carapaces and multiple limbs that ended in cruel-looking claws, and they moved through the colony with terrible efficiency, cutting down anyone who stood in their path, while others were dragged away screaming into massive transport ships that blocked out the sky. "What are they?" whispered Ensign Tommy Park, his young face pale with horror as he watched the footage. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, "but we're going to find out." Within hours of their arrival, 3 enormous ships appeared in orbit above them, their designs completely alien and their weapon systems already powering up, with an ominous hum that the Valor's Edge sensors detected immediately. "Commander, we're being hailed," Laura announced, her voice carefully controlled, even as her hands trembled slightly over her console. The view screen filled with the image of one of the insectoid creatures, its compound eyes glittering with cold intelligence as it regarded Daniel with what might have been contempt or curiosity, or both. When it spoke, its voice was translated by some unseen technology into words that Daniel could understand, though the tone remained utterly alien and devoid of warmth. "I am Ambassador Zyreth of the Valkyrie," the creature announced, "and I speak for the Dominion Collective, which represents the true powers of this region of space. Your kind has been observed and judged, human, and you have been found inferior." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level when he responded. "You attacked our colony without warning and killed thousands of innocent people. That is an act of war. Ambassador Zyreth made a sound that might have been laughter. War implies two opposing forces of comparable strength, but you are nothing compared to the Dominion. We have ruled these stars for 1,000 years, and species far more advanced than yours have bowed before us, or been swept away like dust in a solar wind. What do you want? Daniel demanded. Your submission, Zyreth replied simply, or your extinction. Those are the only choices available to your kind. Your colonies now belong to the Dominion Collective, and you will surrender them peacefully, or we will take them by force. This is not a negotiation, human. This is a notification of your new reality. Daniel stared at the alien ambassador for a long moment, his mind racing through all the possible responses he could give. Behind him, he could feel his crew watching, waiting to see how their commander would respond to this threat against everything they had built and everyone they loved. I need to contact my government, Daniel finally said. You have one standard day, Zyreth replied, and then we will begin the cleansing of your outer colonies. Choose wisely, human. The transmission ended, leaving Daniel staring at a blank screen while his heart pounded in his chest. He turned to Laura, who was already preparing a priority message for Earth. Send everything we have, he ordered. Every piece of footage, every scan, every word that creature said. Command needs to know what we're facing. On Earth, Admiral Patricia Cole received the transmission in her office at United Earth Command Headquarters, watching the footage from Kepler 442b with growing horror and fury burning in her chest. She had spent 40 years serving humanity, rising through the ranks during some of the most turbulent times in human history, and she had never seen anything like this. When Ambassador Zyreth's ultimatum finished playing, she immediately convened an emergency session with the heads of every human colony and military installation across known space. The faces on her screen were grim, frightened, angry, and determined in equal measure. They want us to surrender, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs and gasps. They think we're weak because we're young, because we've only had faster-than-light travel for 2 centuries, while they've ruled these stars for millennia. She paused, looking at each face in turn, before continuing. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Admiral Cole stood, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights, as she addressed the assembled leaders of humanity. We have survived ice ages and plagues and world wars. We have crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars. We have faced extinction 100 times, and we are still here, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Her voice rose, filled with a fire that spread to every heart listening across the vast distances of space. Send our response to these Velkari and their Dominion Collective. Humanity does not surrender, not today, not ever, not to anyone. When Daniel received the message from Earth, a fierce pride swelled in his chest. The aliens had expected fear and submission, but they would receive something very different instead. Far away, Ambassador Zyreth received humanity's response and made that strange laughing sound again. Certain that these primitive creatures were signing their own death warrant. The Velkari had conquered dozens of species, and not one had ever posed a real threat. They had no idea what was coming for them. News of the alien ultimatum spread across human space like wildfire, racing from colony to colony through faster-than-light communication relays, until every man, woman, and child knew that something terrible had arrived from the darkness between the stars. On Earth, protests erupted in the streets of every major city, with some demanding peace at any cost, while others called for immediate and devastating retaliation against the creatures who had slaughtered innocent colonists without mercy or warning. The United Earth Parliament convened an emergency session that lasted for 3 days without pause, as politicians and military leaders debated the best course of action. Some argued that humanity should negotiate, that perhaps the aliens could be reasoned with, that surely there was some way to avoid the coming storm. But others remembered human history, remembered all the times that weakness had been mistaken for an invitation to conquest, and they knew that surrender would only delay the inevitable destruction of everything humanity had built among the stars. When the vote finally came, it was overwhelming. Humanity would fight. General Marcus Kane received the news in his quarters aboard the space station orbiting Mars, where he had been enjoying a rare moment of peace after decades of service. He was 63 years old, with gray hair cropped short, and a face that bore the scars of battles fought on a dozen worlds, from the frozen plains of Europa to the burning cities of the Martian insurgency. He had hoped to retire soon, to spend his remaining years watching the sunset over the Olympus Mons from a small cabin he had purchased with his savings. But when Admiral Cole called with orders to assume command of all human defense forces, he knew that retirement would have to wait. "We need you, Marcus," Patricia said, her face tired but determined on the view screen. "We need someone who understands war. He knows how to turn scared soldiers into an army that can face anything." "These aren't human rebels or colonial militias," Marcus replied. "These are aliens with technology we don't understand, and ships that make ours look like toys." "I know," Patricia admitted, "but you're the best we have, and right now, the best is what humanity needs." Marcus nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. "Send me everything you have on these Valkyrie and their Dominion Collective. I want to know how they fight, how they think, what they fear," Patricia asked. "Do they fear anything?" "Everything fears something," Marcus replied, "and we're going to find out what makes these bugs run screaming into the night." Within a week, General Kane had assembled his command staff aboard the carrier Ironclad Resolve, a massive vessel that served as the flagship of the human defense fleet. His second-in-command was Colonel Samantha Drake, a tactical genius who had led the counterinsurgency on Titan and earned a reputation for seeing patterns in chaos that others missed entirely. Captain Kevin Ortega commanded the fighter squadrons, a decorated pilot who had survived the Battle of New Shanghai when his entire wing was destroyed around him. He had pulled 3 wounded pilots from burning cockpits that day, refusing to leave anyone behind, even as enemy fire tore through the sky around him. Dr. Nathan Cross was the only civilian on the command staff, a physicist who had been studying theoretical alien technology for 20 years, and now found himself facing the real thing. His job was to analyze captured equipment and find weaknesses that human forces could exploit. "The Valkyrie use plasma-based weapons," Nathan explained during their first briefing, pointing to holographic displays showing the damage from Kepler 442b. "Their ships are faster than ours, and their shields are stronger, but their tactics are rigid and predictable." "How do you know that?" Samantha asked, leaning forward with interest. "Because they've been winning for 1,000 years, Nathan replied. "They've never had to adapt, never had to change, never had to face an enemy that didn't follow their rules. They expect species to fight in certain ways, and when those species lose, it confirms the Valkyrie's belief in their own superiority." Marcus smiled grimly. "So we don't play by their rules." "Exactly," Nathan agreed. "We do what humans have always done when facing a stronger enemy. We cheat." The first real test came sooner than anyone expected. Valkyrie scout fleets appeared at the edge of human space, probing defenses and testing response times with the casual arrogance of predators who had never known fear. At Proxima Station, a vital supply depot that fed resources to 3 colonial systems, a single human destroyer called the Defiant Spirit faced down 3 Valkyrie cruisers that arrived without warning. The enemy ships were each twice the size of the human vessel, and their weapons powered up with the patient confidence of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Captain Linda Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant Spirit, watching the alien ships approach as her crew prepared for what seemed like certain death. She was 34 years old, with a husband and 2 children waiting for her back on Earth, and every instinct screamed at her to run while she still had the chance. But behind her was Proxima Station, filled with 10,000 civilians who would be slaughtered if she retreated. The station's defenses were minimal, designed to handle pirates and smugglers rather than alien warships, and they would last perhaps 5 minutes against the approaching cruisers. "All hands," Linda announced over the ship-wide comm, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her heart. "This is the captain. We have 3 enemy ships incoming, and we're the only thing standing between them and the station. I won't lie to you and say this is going to be easy, because it's going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done." She paused, looking around at her crew, at the faces she had come to know over 3 years of service together. "But we are not going to let those civilians die. We are going to hold this line until reinforcements arrive, no matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs." What followed was 6 hours of brutal combat that would become legendary throughout human space. The Defiant Spirit used every trick in the book and invented a few new ones, hiding in asteroid shadows and launching surprise attacks, targeting enemy weapon systems with pinpoint precision and refusing to die no matter how much damage the Velkari inflicted. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the Defiant Spirit battered and burning, with half her crew dead or wounded, but still fighting with everything she had left. The 3 Velkari cruisers retreated in confusion, unable to understand how a single inferior vessel had held them off for so long. Back on the Velkari homeworld, High Commander Vexarn reviewed the reports from Proxima Station with growing unease. According to every psychological profile the Dominion had compiled, humans should have surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming force, should have begged for mercy, and accepted their place as servants of a superior species. Instead, they had fought like cornered animals, with a ferocity and determination that made no logical sense. Even more disturbing were the reports from ground forces who had faced human soldiers in brief skirmishes along the frontier. "They don't break," one commander reported, his compound eyes wide with something that might have been confusion or the first stirrings of fear. "We kill 10 of them, and the 11th keeps fighting. We destroy their positions, and they retreat only to counterattack from a new direction. They use tactics we've never seen before, as if they've been fighting wars their entire existence." Vexarn dismissed these concerns with a wave of one clawed limb. "They are primitives who have simply not yet learned that resistance is futile. Once we crush their main fleet, they will submit like all the others." He had no idea how wrong he was. The Dominion launched its main offensive 6 weeks after the first ultimatum, sending a massive fleet of 200 warships toward the Epsilon Eridani system with orders to crush all resistance and make an example that would break human morale forever. This system was home to 12 million people spread across 3 habitable worlds and dozens of orbital stations, representing one of humanity's largest and most prosperous colonial holdings. General Marcus Kane had only 60 ships to defend it. He stood on the bridge of the ironclad Resolve, watching the enemy fleet appear on long-range sensors like a swarm of angry hornets descending upon their target. Beside him, Colonel Samantha Drake was already calculating angles of attack and defensive positions, her mind working through thousands of possible scenarios in search of anything that might give them an advantage. "They outnumber us more than 3 to 1, she said quietly, "and their ships are individually more powerful than ours. By any reasonable calculation, we should retreat and regroup." "Retreat to where?" Marcus asked, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. "If we abandon Epsilon Eridani, we lose 12 million civilians and the industrial capacity to build the ships we need. This is where we make our stand, Win or lose. Captain Kevin Ortega's voice crackled over the comm from his fighter, where he waited with 300 pilots who knew they might not survive the next few hours. General, my squadrons are ready. Hold position until I give the signal, Marcus ordered. We're going to let them come to us. The Valkyrie commander leading the assault was named Krethos, a decorated warrior who had conquered 7 species and never known defeat. He looked upon the pitiful human fleet with something close to amusement, wondering why these creatures bothered to resist when their destruction was so clearly inevitable. All ships, advance in standard formation, he ordered. We will sweep away these insects, and then descend upon their worlds. By nightfall, this system will belong to the Dominion. The battle began with a Valkyrie barrage that lit up the darkness of space with brilliant plasma fire, and the first human casualties came within minutes. The cruiser Stalwart Falls took a direct hit to her reactor core and exploded in a flash of light that was visible from the nearest planet. Captain Greg Mitchell died with his ship, along with 400 crew members who had served with him through a dozen campaigns. In his final moments, he managed to steer his crippled vessel into the path of 2 Valkyrie destroyers, taking them with him into oblivion and buying precious seconds for the civilian transports fleeing toward the inner system. Stalwart Falls is gone, someone reported, their voice cracking with grief and shock. Then we make sure they didn't die for nothing, Marcus replied, his voice hard as iron. All ships, execute pattern Delta. Let's show these bugs how humans fight. What followed was 3 days of continuous combat, the longest and bloodiest engagement in human history up to that point. The humans used every advantage they could find, hiding in the radiation shadows of gas giants, using asteroid fields as cover, launching hit-and-run attacks that struck without warning and vanished before the Valkyrie could respond. Colonel Drake proved her genius again and again, spotting weaknesses in the enemy formation that others missed, and directing counterattacks that inflicted damage far beyond what should have been possible. At one point, she noticed that Valkyrie ships always turned the same direction when evading torpedoes, and she used this predictability to lay a trap that destroyed 6 enemy cruisers in a single devastating ambush. Captain Ortega led his fighter squadrons in a desperate assault on the Valkyrie flagship, weaving through a storm of defensive fire that should have been impossible to survive. Half his pilots died in the attack, but the survivors managed to damage the ship's command systems badly enough that Krethos lost contact with a third of his fleet for nearly an hour. Dr. Nathan Cross broadcast a jamming frequency he had developed from studying captured Valkyrie equipment, disrupting enemy communications during the most critical moments of the battle. When Krethos tried to coordinate a final overwhelming assault, his orders were lost in static, and his ships stumbled into defensive fire they had not expected. On the 3rd day, with both fleets exhausted and bleeding, the Valkyrie finally retreated. They had lost 80 ships, more than any Dominion force had lost in 500 years. And Krethos himself died when his damaged flagship was destroyed by a final volley from the human survivors. Humanity had lost 34 ships and thousands of brave souls, but Epsilon Eridani remained free. Far away on the Valkyrie homeworld, High Commander Vexarn received the news with disbelief that slowly transformed into cold fury. How could these primitive creatures have defeated a Dominion fleet? How could they have killed Krethos and destroyed so many ships? How could they have done the impossible? He demanded answers, and the reports that came back only deepened his confusion and growing unease. They adapt too quickly, one analyst explained. We use a tactic against them and they develop a counter within hours. They sacrifice themselves without hesitation to protect their comrades. They fight with a desperation that borders on madness, as if death means nothing to them compared to victory. Among the human prisoners taken during the battle was Sergeant Amy Torres, a Marine, who had been captured when her boarding team was overwhelmed during a raid on a Valkyrie supply ship. She was brought before Valkyrie interrogators who expected her to break quickly under their questioning. Instead, she laughed in their faces. "You have made a terrible mistake," she told them, her voice steady, despite the bruises and cuts that covered her body. "You think you're the first enemy humanity has faced? The first threat that wanted to destroy us?" The interrogators exchanged confused glances, but Amy continued without waiting for them to respond. "Let me tell you about human history, about all the times we should have died and didn't." She told them about ancient battles, where 300 warriors held a mountain pass against an army of thousands, buying time for their people to escape. She told them about cities where human soldiers fought house by house, room by room, through winters so cold that weapons froze in their hands, refusing to surrender even when all hope seemed lost. She told them about a siege at a place called Armstrong Base on the moon Europa, where 200 Marines held out for 40 days without resupply against rebel forces that outnumbered them 20-1. They had eaten their boots and melted ice for water and fought with broken weapons and bare hands. And when reinforcements finally arrived, 63 of them were still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give up. "You think you can break us?" Amy asked, her eyes burning with a fire that made the interrogator step back unconsciously. "Species far more terrible than you have tried, and we destroyed them all. We have been fighting since before we could write, since before we built cities, since before we even knew there were stars in the sky." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than any shout. "We don't know how to surrender, and we will never stop fighting until you are nothing but a warning in our history books." The interrogators reported her words to High Commander Vexarn, and for the first time in his long career, he felt something he had not experienced in 1,000 years of conquest and victory. He felt fear. 6 months had passed since the first Valkyrie ships appeared in human space. 6 months of blood and fire and sacrifice that had forged humanity's scattered colonial forces into something new and terrifying. Where once there had been separate fleets defending their own systems, now there was a unified war machine with a single purpose and an unbreakable will to survive. General Marcus Kane had spent those months building alliances and gathering resources, reaching out to every human colony, no matter how small or distant. Some had ships to offer. Others had soldiers or weapons or raw materials. And Marcus accepted everything, because he knew that the coming battle would require every advantage humanity could gather. Now, standing in the war room of the ironclad Resolve, he looked out at the faces of his command staff, and knew that the time had finally come to stop defending and start attacking. "Operation Retribution," he announced, bringing up a holographic display that showed a star system far from human space. "Our target is Valkyrie Prime itself." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what he was proposing. No one had ever attacked the Valkyrie homeworld. No species had ever dared to bring war to the heart of the Dominion Collective. And the very idea seemed like madness. Colonel Samantha Drake was the first to speak. "The defenses around Valkyrie Prime are the strongest in Dominion space. They have orbital platforms, planetary shields, and at least 100 warships stationed there at all times." "I know," Marcus replied calmly, "which is why we're bringing 300 ships." Captain Kevin Ortega let out a low whistle. "That's almost every combat-capable vessel humanity has. If we lose this battle, there won't be anything left to defend our colonies. If we don't take this risk, we'll spend the next decade fighting a war of attrition that we can't win," Marcus countered. "The Valkyrie have more ships, more resources, more everything. Our only chance is to hit them so hard that they have no choice but to negotiate." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer in turn. "We're not going to Valkyrie Prime to conquer it. We're going to send a message that humanity is not prey to be hunted, and if the Dominion wants to keep fighting, we'll burn their worlds just like they burned ours." Leading the ground assault would be Lieutenant Colonel Derek Santos, a Marine commander whose troops have become legendary for their ferocity during the war. He had led counterattacks on 3 different worlds, reclaiming territory that the Valkyrie thought they had secured, and his soldiers followed him with a loyalty that bordered on worship. His second in command was Sergeant Major Holly Chen, who had earned her reputation in the tunnels beneath Ganymede's frozen surface. When Valkyrie troops tried to use the underground passages to bypass human defenses, Holly had led a team of 50 Marines into the darkness and hunted them like ghosts, emerging 3 weeks later with only 12 survivors, but not a single alien left alive behind them. "We're going to drop into the capital city," Derek explained to his gathered Marines. "Our objective is the Grand Assembly Hall, where the Dominion's leaders will be gathered. We're not there to kill them, we're there to show them that nowhere is safe from human reach." "And if they try to stop us?" one young Marine asked. Derek smiled grimly. "Then we remind them why they should be afraid of us." The human fleet departed in the dead of night, slipping through the darkness between stars, with running lights extinguished and communications locked down. They traveled for 2 weeks through uncharted space, using routes that human scouts had mapped in secret, avoiding Dominion patrol lanes and hiding in nebulae when enemy sensors came too close. When 300 human warships appeared in the skies above Valkyrie Prime, the defenders could not believe what their instruments were telling them. This was supposed to be impossible. The humans were supposed to be cowering in their colonies and begging for mercy, not bringing war to the heart of Dominion power. Admiral Patricia Cole commanded from the flagship Unconquered, coordinating a 3-pronged assault that struck the orbital defenses from multiple angles simultaneously. The Valkyries scrambled to respond, but their rigid tactics worked against them as human squadrons appeared where they were not expected and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. "First wave of orbital platforms destroyed," Colonel Drake reported from her station. "Enemy reinforcements are trying to form a defensive line near the 3rd moon." "Kevin, take your fighters and keep them busy," Patricia ordered. "We need to clear a path for the ground forces." Captain Ortega acknowledged and led his squadrons into the chaos, weaving through defensive fire and enemy fighters with the skill of a pilot who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. When Dominion reinforcements arrived from neighboring systems through the hyperspace relay, Kevin made a decision that would be remembered for generations. "All squadrons follow me," he broadcast, turning his fighter toward the massive relay station that allowed ships to travel between stars. "We're taking out that relay." It was a suicide mission, and everyone who followed him knew it. But if they succeeded, the Valkyrie reinforcements would be trapped and unable to help defend their homeworld. 20 fighters reached the relay, and only 3 survived long enough to launch their torpedoes. Captain Ortega was not among them, his fighter destroyed just moments before the relay exploded, in a flash of light that could be seen from the planet's surface. But his sacrifice was not in vain. With the relay destroyed, the Dominion reinforcements were cut off, and the human fleet had time to complete its mission. It didn't matter. "Breach charges ready," Holly reported. "Blow it," Derek ordered. The doors exploded inward, and the Marines poured through the gap like a flood breaking through a dam. Inside, the leaders of the Dominion Collective cowered behind overturned furniture and terrified guards, watching in disbelief as human soldiers secured the room with brutal efficiency. High Commander Vexarn stood alone among his peers, refusing to hide as Derek Santos approached him with weapon raised. The 2 enemies stared at each other across a distance of a few feet, and a gulf of understanding that seemed impossible to bridge. "You cannot win," Vexarn said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had once held. Even if you kill us all, the Dominion will send more fleets, more soldiers, more ships until your species is nothing but a memory. General Kane's voice came through the communication system, broadcast across every Velkari frequency on the planet, and throughout the system. Humanity did not start this war, but we will finish it. The killing can end today, or it can continue until every Dominion world burns like our colonies burned. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The choice is yours. High Commander Vexarn stood in the ruins of the Grand Assembly Hall, surrounded by human marines who watched him with weapons ready, and faced the most difficult decision of his long life. Around him, the other leaders of the Dominion Collective whispered among themselves, their compound eyes darting between the human soldiers and the tactical displays showing the devastation in orbit above their world. For 1,000 years, the Velkari had ruled this region of space with absolute confidence in their superiority. They had crushed species that dared to resist and absorbed those wise enough to submit, building an empire that stretched across 100 star systems and commanded resources beyond counting. Now, human ships hung in the skies above their homeworld, and human soldiers stood in their most sacred halls, and everything they had believed about their place in the universe was crumbling around them. "You speak of ending the killing," Vexarn said slowly, his voice carrying through the chamber where his ancestors had proclaimed their dominion over the stars. "But how can there be peace between our peoples after so much blood has been spilled?" General Marcus Kane's response came through the communication system, calm and measured, but carrying an edge of steel that left no doubt about his determination. Peace is always possible when both sides want it badly enough. The question is whether you want it more than you want to keep fighting a war you cannot win. Before Vexarn could respond, another voice entered the conversation, one that surprised everyone in the chamber. It was Ambassador Thalros of the Sindari, a moderate faction within the Galactic Council that had watched the war with growing concern. "High Commander, I speak now on behalf of several species within the Council," Thalros said, his tone careful but firm. "The Velkari's aggression against humanity has destabilized our entire region. Your allies are questioning whether the Dominion Collective serves their interests or merely your own ambitions." Vexarn's compound eyes narrowed. "You would side with these primitives against your own allies?" "I would side with whoever offers the best chance for peace and stability," Thalros replied. "And right now, that appears to be humanity." "Lieutenant Laura Vance has been in communication with my people throughout this conflict, and we have been impressed by their willingness to seek alternatives to endless warfare." In the war room of the Unconquered, Laura Vance allowed herself a small smile. Her secret diplomatic efforts over the past months had finally paid off, creating cracks in the Dominion alliance that humanity could exploit. "The choice remains yours, High Commander," Marcus continued. "Surrender and negotiate, or watch as we destroy everything you have built. We have proven that we can reach your homeworld, and we can return as many times as necessary until this war ends on terms we find acceptable." The chamber fell silent as Vexarn considered his options. He could feel the fear radiating from the other Dominion leaders, could see the doubt in their eyes as they realized that their 1,000-year empire might be coming to an end. Finally, he bowed his head in a gesture that no Velkari had made to another species in living memory. "We will negotiate." The Treaty of New Geneva was signed 6 weeks later in a ceremony that brought together representatives from humanity and a dozen alien species. The terms were harsh but fair, requiring the Dominion to restore all human territory, pay reparations for the destroyed colonies, and release all prisoners, including Sergeant Amy Torres, who emerged from captivity thinner but unbroken. Most importantly, humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Council, with all the rights and protections that status provided. No longer could any species attack human colonies without facing consequences from the entire interstellar community. General Marcus Kane returned to Earth as a hero, greeted by crowds that filled the streets of every city and celebrations that lasted for days. But he took no joy in the victory, spending most of his time visiting the families of soldiers who would never come home. "Too many good people died to get us here," he told Admiral Patricia Cole during a quiet moment away from the celebrations. "I only hope it was worth the price." "It was," Patricia assured him. "Because of what they sacrificed, humanity has a future among the stars. That's worth any price." Commander Daniel Harris was promoted to Admiral and given command of the newly formed First Contact Fleet, a task force dedicated to exploring the unknown regions beyond Council space. His mission was to seek out new civilizations and make sure that humanity's first contact with them went better than their encounter with the Valkyrie. Laura Vance became humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Council, where she worked tirelessly to build alliances and prevent future wars. Her intelligence and diplomatic skill earned the respect of species who had initially dismissed humans as primitive newcomers, and she became known as someone who could find common ground between the most bitter enemies. Colonel Samantha Drake returned to Earth and established the Kane Military Academy, named in honor of the general who had led humanity through its darkest hour. There, she trained the next generation of human warriors, passing on the lessons learned during the war so that humanity would never again be caught unprepared. Dr. Nathan Cross continued his research into alien technology, working with Valkyrie scientists who had once been enemies but now found themselves fascinated by human ingenuity. Together, they made discoveries that closed the technological gap between humanity and the older species, ensuring that humans would never again be seen as inferior. Sergeant Amy Torres was freed from captivity and returned to Earth, where she wrote a memoir about her experiences that became required reading in schools across human space. Her words about human resilience and determination inspired generations of young people to believe that they could overcome any obstacle. Captain Kevin Ortega did not survive the battle, but his sacrifice was never forgotten. Every year, on the anniversary of Operation Retribution, pilots across human space flew in formation and broadcast his final words, reminding everyone of the price that had been paid for freedom. In the halls of the Galactic Council, the other species watched humanity with new eyes. These strange, short-lived creatures from a small blue world had proven themselves in ways that no one had expected, earning their place among the stars through courage and sacrifice rather than ancient heritage or superior technology. They were no longer dismissed as primitives or newcomers. They were respected, and in many cases, feared. Ambassador Thalros often told the story of the human war to younger members of his species, explaining how a civilization barely 2 centuries old had defeated an empire that had ruled for 1,000 years. "They don't have our longevity, or our technology, or our numbers," he would say, "but they have something we lack." "What is that?" the young ones would ask. "They never give up," Thalros would reply. "They face impossible odds and fight anyway. They lose battles and come back stronger. They watch their friends die and honor them by continuing the struggle. They are the most stubborn, determined, and terrifying species I have ever encountered." In the whispered conversations of 100 alien worlds, a new saying took hold, passed from generation to generation as a warning and a reminder. Never underestimate the humans, for they are survivors and fighters, forged in the fires of a world that tried to kill them 1,000 times and failed. They had crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars, and now the stars belonged to them as much as any ancient empire. Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same.